The story of Hester van Wyk, from Recognizing Blues by Herman Bosman. When I think of the story of Hester van Wyk, I often wonder what it is about some stories that I have wanted to tell, Sculpt Lawrence said. About things that have happened and about people that I have known, and that I still know, some of them. If you can call it knowing a person when your mule carts pass each other on the government road, and you wave your hat cheerfully and call out that it will be a good season for the crops, if only the stalk borers and other pests keep away. And the other person just nods at you with a distant sort of look in his eyes and says, yes, the Mariku bushveld has unfortunately got more than just one kind of pest. That was what Harvey Steyn said to me one afternoon on the government road when I was on my way to the Droogevlei post office for letters, and he was on his way home. And it was because of the sorrowful sort of way in which he uttered the word unfortunately that I knew that Harvey Steyn had heard what I had said about him to Frick Prinsloo 3 weeks before, after the meeting of the Dwarsberg Debating Society in the schoolroom next to the poort. As I have said, this story about Harvey Steyn and his wife is one of those stories that I never finished telling. And I would never have known either that Frick Prinsloo had listened to as much of it as I had told him if it wasn't for Harvey Steyn's manner of greeting me on the government road 3 weeks later with sorrowful politeness, like an Englishman. There's always something unusual about a story that does not come to an end on its own. It's as though that story keeps going on, getting told in a different way each time, as though the story itself is trying to find out what happened next. It was like the way life came to Hester van Wyk. Hester was a very pretty girl with black hair and a way of smiling that seemed very childlike, until you were close enough to her to see what was in her eyes. And then you realized, in that same moment, that no child had ever smiled like that. And whether it was for her black hair, or whether it was because of her smile, it so happened that Hester van Wyk was hardly ever without a lover. They came to her, the young men from the neighborhood. But they also went away again. They tarried for a while, like birds in their passage, and they paid court to her. And sometimes the period in which they wooed her was quite long. And at other times she would have a lover whose ardour seemed to last for no longer than a few brief weeks before he also went on his way. And it seemed that the story of Hester and her lovers was also one of those stories that I have mentioned to you, whose end never gets told. And Gert van Wyk, Hester's father, would talk to me about these young men that came into his daughter's life. He talked to me both as a neighbor and as a relative on his wife's side. And while what he said to me about Hester and her lovers were mostly words spoken lightly, in the way that you flick a pebble into a dam and watch the yellow ripples widening, there were also times when he spoke differently. And then what he said was like the way a footsore wanderer flings his pack onto the ground.
She's a pretty girl,
Gert said to me.
Yes, she's pretty enough. But her trouble is that she's too soft-hearted. These young men come to her, and they tell her stories, sad stories about their lives. And she listens to their stories, and she feels sorry for them. And she says that they must be very nice young men for life to have treated them so badly. She even tries to tell me some of these stories, so that I should feel sorry for them. But of course, I have got too much sense to listen. I simply tell her,
Yes, I answered, nodding. You tell her that what the young man says is a lot of lies. And by the time you've convinced her about one lover's lies, you find that he's already departed, and that some other young man has got into the habit of coming to your house 3 times a week, and that he is busy telling her a totally new and different story.
That's what he imagines,
Gert van Wyk replied.
That it's new, but it's always the same old story. Only, instead of telling of his unhappy childhood, the new young man will talk about his aged mother, or about how life has been cruel to him, so that he has got to help on the farm, for which he isn't suited at all, because it makes him dizzy to have to pump water out of the borehole for the cattle, up and down, like that, with a pump handle, when all the time his real ambition is to have a job of wearing a blue and gold uniform outside a bioscope in Johannesburg. And my daughter Hester is so soft-hearted that she goes on listening to these same stupid stories, day after day, year in and year out. Yes, I said, they are all the same old stories. And I thought of what Harvey Stein said about the man who sang old songs to his wife. And it seemed that Hester van Wyk's was also an old story, and for that reason it would never end. Did she also have a young man who said that he was not worthy of her because he was not educated? I asked Gert. And did she take pity on him because he said people looked down on him because of his table manners? Yes, Gert answered with alacrity. He said he was badly brought up and always forgot to take the teaspoon out of the cup before drinking his coffee.
Did she also have a young man who got her sympathy by telling her that he had fallen in love years ago and that he had lost that girl because her parents had objected to him and that he could never fall in love again?
Quite right,
Gert said.
This young man said that his first girl's parents refused to let her marry him because his forehead was too low, even though he tried to make it look higher by training his eyebrows down and shaving the hair off most of the top of his head. But how do you know all these things? There are only a few stories that young men tell girls in order to get their sympathy, I said to Gert. There are only a handful of stories like that. But it seems to me that your daughter Hester has been told them all. And more than once too, sometimes, by the look of it. And you can imagine how awful that young man with the low forehead looked,
Gert continued.
He must have been unattractive enough before. But with his eyebrows trained down and the top of his head shaved clean off, he looked more like a...
And for that very reason, of course, I explained, your daughter Hester fell in love with him after she heard his story. And it seemed to me that the oldest story of all must be the story of a woman's heart. It was some years after this, when Gert van Wyk and his family had moved out of the Mariku and into the Waterberg, that I heard that Hester van Wyk had got married. And I knew then what had happened, of course. And I knew it even without Gert having to tell me. I knew then that some young man must have come to Hester van Wyk from out of some far-lying part of the Waterberg. He came to her and found her, and in finding her, he had no story to tell. But what I have no means of telling, now that I have related to you all that I know, is whether this is the end of the story about Hester van Wyk or not.